Homage is like the nice way of saying ripping off. It's one of those wonderful little things where you can get away with stealing from someone else because you can say that you're affectionate about it and that you're honoring what came before, and fair dues, that can have its place. But the fact is, you've got to find a way to walk that fine line and make sure that you create something that can stand on its own two legs instead of having the audience wonder why they're not just watching whatever it is that you're honoring. Mars Attacks, much like, say, films like Sky Captain and The World of Tomorrow, which I may get to at a later date, suffer from the problem of just never quite knowing what they really want to be. And having sat down with the film twice now, I honestly can say I have no idea really what to make of it. At points it's too silly to be taken seriously, but then at other points it wants to be taken seriously and is way too silly. It's a film that doesn't really seem to know when to start and stop telling jokes, and as a result, throughout, I'm just confused as to what I'm supposed to be reacting to. Am I supposed to laugh at this, or am I supposed to take it seriously? In a lot of the kind of films that this is obviously paying homage to, a big source of the unintentional comedy, emphasis on unintentional, was the fact that you were having these really stupid plots and this really hokey dialogue being delivered by actors who were doing it completely straight-faced as if they were reading a Tennessee Williams play. Here, when they try and do it deliberately, it just comes across as insincere, and as a result, whatever was there completely falls flat. Not to mention when the film goes for the really silly, big slapstick acts that feel like they're out of a Zucker Brothers film, like a whole bowling sequence in Las Vegas where an alien rips up a giant bowling ball and knocks over a bunch of buildings. That should be funny, but something about it just doesn't click. Or in particular, the opening sequence of the film, the first minute or so of the Burning Cattle, which is a tribute to one of the original Topps cards, which this film is based on, and then the build-up to it with the whole farmer-smelling barbecue thing. Something about it just doesn't click. I'm not sure if Burton just doesn't know how to tell those kind of jokes, or if it's just a case of the writing not being sharp enough and making that funny enough, but that kind of set the precedent for what was to follow. A film that could never quite find its footing as to how silly it wanted to be. And honestly, a film being cheesy and wacky is not the worst thing in the world, and there are points where it does almost come together, especially whenever the aliens are on screen, and that's when the film plays it most on its sleeve and shows its intentions clearly. But then it'll cut from that to the human characters, and they try to, almost bizarrely, give them legitimate stories, like a young, shy boy who has to save his grandmother and ultimately becomes the hero in the end, or another story about a divorced dad who has to get back to his kids and has to deal with some marital troubles along the way. Not only do these get in the way of the big set pieces and the really silly stuff that the film at points really wants to lean to, but it's played completely straight and not in the way that I mentioned beforehand. There's nothing ironic here, there's nothing about it being too silly or wacky, or the fact that they're playing it completely straight. Here, it's as if it's a completely different film, as if it's just a regular summer movie, where they try and give you the human aspect to go between the special effects. But it doesn't work at all here, because all the characters are deliberately painted as archetypes in order to fit in with the broad parody of alien movies. As a result, how can you really get into their heads or get to know them or feel for them if they're supposed to be props for the bigger gags? Like the whole thing with the scientist and a dumb bimbo presenter who end up having their limbs replaced, shall we say. If the film had gone in that direction with the characters and actually played up more of the sci-fi-ness and actually heightened more of the absurdity when it came to that, again like the films that it's supposed to be honoring, maybe I wouldn't have as big of a deal with getting into it. But because it seems to shift from really goofy and wacky and silly, and at points a little bit morbid, such as the scene where the general gets crushed by the alien when he's miniaturized, to then this stuff that feels like it came right out of any number of late 90s bad summer blockbusters, it just doesn't mesh well, and ultimately I'm left wondering, Tim, I know you can do comedy, and I know that this material might lend itself to some fun stuff, and the Mars Attacks cards in and of themselves are spoofs of a lot of popular sci-fi tropes, but I don't know where you're really going with this. Again, comedy is subjective, and if you find this film to be the funniest thing ever made, more power to you. But for me, it just never clicked for me, and I think part of that comes down to, again, the indecisive screenplay. Despite Jonathan Gems being the credited writer, this actually had several people attached to it, not unlike a lot of late 90s movies, strangely enough, two of which being Scott Alexander and Larry Karaszewski, the guys behind Ed Wood and Big Eyes. You can just feel the different forces pulling this movie apart, saying, no, I want it to be this, no, I want it to be that, I want it to be really silly slapstick, no, I want it to be some kind of weird social satire about how we interact with aliens, even though that element never really comes to the forefront and is pretty much thrown away within a few seconds. No, I want it to be this legitimate, almost kind of weird 80s fantasy sort of stuff, where you have people dealing with very personal problems and miss fantastic concepts. No, I just want big slapstick. It's that kind of tugging between the different creative forces that just leaves me scratching my head going, what are you trying to make with this? For my money, Dark Shadows, even though it had its own issues, did a better job balancing itself between homage and then tribute, and managed to be a fun and diverting time, and the jokes felt like they meshed better with a lot of the other elements because it very much retained throughout that sort of heightened atmosphere, which this at points doesn't. This might be one of the trickier cinematic confessions I've ever had to do, simply because, again, comedy is so subjective, and for me, it just never hit the sweet spot.